Today, I want to welcome Oakland McCulloch. Been looking forward to this conversation because Oakland is a man of integrity who's had to face leadership decisions that very few of us will ever face in regards to the consequences of his choices. He's a keynote speaker and the author of the book, Your Leadership Legacy, Becoming the Leader You Were Meant to Be. His leadership talk and his book are based on 40 years of experience, over 40 years of experience in combat, in peacemaking operations, disaster relief operations, and in the boardroom. We're going to talk about principles that will benefit today's leaders. Actually, I'm really excited about this because we're going to go into some tough areas. We're going to talk about some tough things, and there are going to be some people who don't agree with what we talk about here. And that's okay. That's the type of people we need to be, is that we can hear opposing opinions and still give them weight. There are going to be people that hear today's interview and they're just going to shout out, yes, that's true. But stay tuned because I think this is going to be an amazing discussion. Oakland, welcome.
Yeah, well, thanks, Craig. I'm looking forward to this, just like you've been. And you're absolutely right in your opening statement there. I mean, we have to be able to listen to other people's opinions. That's what this republic is based on. I mean, that you can't have a republic if you don't have debate. And that's okay. We should get back to having a good debate among people. I tell people all the time, I don't know when in this country it got to the point where if I disagree with you, I have to hate you, because that's not what this is about.
Yeah, and it's, there's a cycle that we go through, and this could be a discussion for another time, but let me, hit on this quickly. We go through 80-year cycles. And if you look back 80 years ago, we were a little cantankerous back then.
Yeah.
If you look at 80 years before that, we fought a civil war. If you look at 80 years before that, we fought a revolutionary war.
Yeah.
So, I just throw that out to say, yes, we're in a horrible spot as a nation, but part of our discussion today is don't lose hope. Let's figure out the path forward together.
Right. That's right.
And it will make us uncomfortable. And that's okay. That's okay. So, you were in the Army. I think I forgot to highlight, you went to U.S. Military Academy, and which is extremely hard to get into. And it's a place where leaders are built. And you were in the Army, and I was in the Marines, and of course there's this tension between the Army and the Marine Corps. Chesty Puller had some choice words, and but as I've gotten to know you, you are a man of integrity. You're a solid leader, and I think people need to hear what you have to say. What inclined you towards the military? What inclined you towards leadership?
Yeah, well, I was always a leader. Growing up, I was captain of my sports teams. I was student government president, class president, those kinds of things. So I felt like that's something I was not only that I liked, but I was good at. At least I hope I was. And then about my sophomore, into my sophomore, beginning of my junior year, as I was looking at colleges and figuring out what I wanted to do, I looked at the military academy, I looked at ROTC, and I just decided I wanted to be an officer in the Army and explore that realm of leadership. And, I think one of the things that drove me to the military, at least I know it was one of the things, and it certainly was one of the things that kept me in, was, I grew up in a poorer family. I won't say we were poor, but we certainly weren't. We didn't have a lot of money, and yet, my father never finished the 8th grade. My mom never finished the 10th grade. Now they went back, got their GEDs, but as far as schooling goes, that's as far as they went. And yet I got to make a choice to go to the United States Military Academy. Nowhere else in the world does that happen, where somebody like me can get the opportunities that I had and get to retire a lieutenant colonel from the Army and be where I am today. And I always said one of the reasons I did what I did was because I wanted other people, my children, your children, somebody else's children, to have the same opportunities that I had growing up.
Yeah. And that is something that's amazing. I had on the podcast a guy who grew up in Russia, and his central message was, yes, America has problems. Well, this wasn't the message of his podcast, but he and I talked offline, and he said, yeah, there's problems in America. You have no idea how bad it could be.
No, I've been in 45 countries on 5 continents, you know, a lot of that because of the military. And I always tell people, even with all our problems, and we have plenty, this is still the greatest country in the world.
Yeah. So a direction I'd like to go for the next few minutes is rules of engagement. And I think we can go back to wars that you fought in, and I think there's some parallels for real life. Now, we were both active duty back during the first Gulf War,
Right.
and you were a tank commander in northern Kuwait. Is that correct?
During the first Gulf War, I was a general's aide.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But we have rules of engagement, and if I'm remembering correctly, and I'm sure you know them way better than I do for that war. I was over in Japan at the time. But one of the rules was we couldn't go into Iraq.
Right.
And there was this big tank battle up in northern Kuwait, and H.R. McMaster.
Well, we went into Iraq, but we couldn't cross the Euphrates River.
Okay, was that it then?
Yeah.
Did McMaster cross the line?
I don't think he did. I've read his book on the Battle of 73 Easting, and I think, I know he got in a lot of hot water because of some of his opinions, but I think what he did was right, and taking care of his soldiers was that was his issue, is that we weren't taking care of soldiers. We were holding them back, not allowing them to do what we've asked them to do, fight and win a war. And I think he made a lot of good decisions, and his book is fantastic.
Well, and I think that's been an ongoing issue. And first off, tell folks what the rules of engagement are, just kind of conceptually. What does it mean to a soldier? What's it mean to Marine?
Yeah. So, but anytime, whether it's wartime, even during peace, the peacekeeping operations I was in, you always have rules of engagement where it's kind of laid out what you are allowed to do and not do. And of course, the number one rule of engagement is you always have the right to self-defense. But other than that, it tells you when you're allowed to use force, what type of force. And so it kind of lays out the groundwork of what you're allowed to do and not allowed to do under certain situations.
And in the engagements that you've been in, where do you see that we got them right, and where did we get them wrong?
So I think, that's an interesting question. In the first Gulf War, I think that we held back some, and you can debate whether or not that was right or wrong, that General Powell made the right decision to cease operations when he did or not. I would argue that some of that is why we went back a second time. But I can understand his point of view as well. I think, the thing that we have to keep in mind when we do rules of engagement is that you got to keep in mind the safety of your soldiers and the safety of non-combatants. And I think that's one of the places that we do a pretty good job, and we have, where we've tried to limit what we call collateral damage, the death of innocent civilians. And I think we do that probably better than most countries, militaries.
Yeah. Well, one of the stories I know, there's a retired Marine colonel here in Dripping Springs, Texas, who told me a story about a Marine sergeant, who they captured some Taliban, and they were interrogating him, and they weren't talking. So he took the leader of the Taliban they had, took him up the hill, put him in a tent, had him tied up, and he fired a round into the dirt. and then came out of the tent, went back downhill and said, "Who's next? Or are you ready to talk?" And sure enough, people started talking. And he got court-martialed and kicked out of the Marine Corps for that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's probably one of those where you're right on the line on what is acceptable and not acceptable. I don't know that situation. I wasn't there. But I know that's one of the things that we have been told not to do, those type of things. Now, whether or not that's the benefit of the unit and the mission that's being accomplished, that's what the leader gets paid for, is to make that decision on the ground.
Well, and I'm a little bit curious about that. I mean, from my perspective, it wasn't torture. Nobody got hurt.
Right.
You know, maybe he pissed his pants, but that's about it. What's the harm?
Yeah. Well, I mean, then you take it further. Then we went to waterboarding. Now that's a different story. It's so, I guess the problem is, where do you draw if once you start down that slope, where does it stop? I guess that would be the argument that people would have against doing what that Marine did, is if you allow that, then what's the next thing that you're going to allow? Again, I think, the leaders on the ground have to maintain control of what's going on. And that's what they get paid to do, is to make those decisions. And I guess the thing that we have to do is we have to trust the leaders that we put in charge, unless they've done something that is illegal or against the rules of engagement. And maybe that was part of I was not in Afghanistan, so I don't know what the rules of engagement there were. Maybe that was addressed. I don't know.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. And I think war is a kind of an interesting situation. It's, I think we have this notion of we're going to fight dignified, gentlemanly wars, and
the enemy has a say.
The enemy has a say, but war by nature is a horrible thing.
It is, absolutely. Anybody who believes otherwise is sadly mistaken. I don't care what. There's no such thing as a nice war. That doesn't exist.
Well, and we believe it's easy to fall into the belief that there are easy, perfect choices. And a story from the first Gulf War that I think of often is, are you familiar with the book Bravo 20?
I've seen it. I have not read it.
Yeah, so it's a British SAS patrol that was dropped into northern Iraq. And if you think back to the first Gulf War, Hussein was launching Scud missiles into Israel, and he was trying to draw Israel into the war, because if Israel fired a shot in anger, then the coalition would fall apart.
Right.
And he was launching Scuds into civilian areas, hitting women and children, non-combatants.
He was doing it into Saudi Arabia as well.
That's right. I'd forgotten about that. And so this SAS patrol, their job was to go drop into northern Iraq in the middle of the night, find the communication line that was giving the targeting information to the Scuds, and break the communication line. And so the general nature of their mission was stop these Scuds from being fired at women and children. Well, they drop in the middle of the night, they get in like a little culvert or something and just lay low until morning. And as the sun's coming up, they hear some bells clanking. And before they know it, there's a little 11-year-old boy staring down at them, sheep herder or goat herder, one or the other. And they have about half a second to make a decision. Do we kill this 11-year-old boy and preserve the mission? Or do we not kill him and not complete the mission, right, and abort? And of course, abort, where do they were dropped in by helicopter. They're not, they're deep in the enemy territory. And so they didn't, but the Iraqi army was 300 yards away. The boy ran to the Iraqi army, alerted the army. And what ended up happening was the mission aborted anyway. And their job then was to try to get into Syria alive. A couple of them died from exposure in the desert. 2 or 3 escaped into Syria, and and the rest got captured. but the impact was Scud missiles kept going into Israel, targeting women and children. And I look at that as one of the imperfect choices of war. Do we kill an 11-year-old boy to save women and children, or do we not kill the 11-year-old boy and allow the continued targeting of women and
Right.
children? There's not, it's a horrible choice.
It is.
And I don't think
And I'm
people,
glad I didn't have to make that choice.
exactly, exactly. So, uh, I, and I think that's something we need to remember when we're engaging in the war. We're putting often very young people in these positions to make these choices, to make imperfect choices.
Yeah,
And based on the choice they make, it haunts their dreams for the rest of their life.
it does. It absolutely does. One of the things I always say is that we do a great job of training people to go to war. We do a horrible job once they come back to help them recover from the things we've asked them to do.
Yeah. So let's kind of go back to the rules of engagement. They're obviously there for a good reason. And sometimes they get crossed. I mean, so let's go all the way back. And this isn't necessarily, I guess it is a rule of engagement. If we go all the way back to the Korean War, MacArthur, MacArthur was a warrior, and he knew we're going to fight the Chinese now, or we're going to fight the Chinese later. Unfortunately, the president didn't agree with him, and he openly disagreed with the president, which got him fired.
Right.
And so let's talk about that from a leadership position. People are working in companies, and they have to figure out their own rules of engagement, and they have to figure out what decisions they're authorized to make and what decisions they're not authorized to make.
Right.
What would you recommend to them?
So the same thing. I don't care what profession you are. If you're a leader, then it comes down to this. When you got to make a decision on whether or not to do something you're being told to do, or asking somebody else, I always tell people to just keep this in mind. You got to like who looks back at you every morning in the mirror. So, you got to, that's the way I always look at it. Am I going to regret this decision for the rest of my life? And here's the thing, and I think we've forgotten this, and I see a lot of leaders who aren't doing this nowadays, is if you disagree with it, then you have to not do it. And if that means you lose your job, then you lose your job. But once you agree and you do it, now you own that decision, and you own the responsibility for doing whatever it is that you did. Even if you were told to do it, that doesn't matter. Now you own it now if you decide to do it. So, you just got to be able to live with the decisions that you make. So think about it that way when you got to make those tough decisions.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and we talked in advance about a few decisions people have faced, that you've faced specifically. And let's start with let's go back to the first Gulf War. One of the weapons that we knew Hussein had was anthrax, which is a nerve agent. And for those that don't know, you get hit with anthrax. My understanding is if you get hit with anthrax, you flop around like a fish and defecate on yourself until you eventually die.
Yeah.
And so the military came up with this little anthrax pill that at least the enlisted were required to take that pill, or they would be court-martialed. And the thought was, let's put a small dose of anthrax into the body to help build up resistance to it. Do you remember that?
I do. I remember that pill. Whether or not it actually had any effectiveness or not, who knows? I mean, it was probably just like a lot of things that they give soldiers, experimental. But I remember taking that pill. I do.
Yeah. What was the general consensus? So I wasn't in theater. I was over in Japan eating sushi. What
Yeah.
was the discussion there in theater?
Yeah, people weren't happy about it, I can tell you. And I'm sure that there's lots of people who some way or another got through without taking it. But yeah, I was, if I had to do over again, I'm not sure that I would take it, but at that point I did.
Yeah. Well, and I've met people with Gulf War syndrome, and and they haven't totally nailed that down, the cause of that, which
Right.
is interesting. We understand a lot of things medically, but we haven't been able to figure out the cause of Gulf War syndrome. But I know one of the potential causes that have been listed is actually that anthrax pill.
Yeah, that and the fumes from the oil fields burning, and probably lots of different things. I know the depleted uranium rounds that we used, all those kinds of things, and maybe it's a combination of all of them together. Maybe the people who got the Gulf War syndrome had exposure to two or three of those things, whereas people like myself, who I don't think I suffer from anything like that, maybe I only got exposed to one of them rather than two or three of them. I mean, who knows? But it's certain I think it's certainly a real thing. And there is a cause, I have no doubt, but I don't know what it is. But my guess is that it's exposure to two or three of the things that they think it is.
Yeah. 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 And and for those who aren't familiar with the depleted uranium, we were using depleted uranium rounds. That was what, an armor piercing round
Right.
that would go right through the was it T-72 tanks that we were.
Yeah, whichever tanks. I mean, it went through all of the tanks, and it wasn't just the Army's tanks using that. Um, I think the Air Force used it, like the A-10, I think uses depleted uranium rounds, or so there was plenty of depleted uranium around the battlefield, no doubt about it.
Yeah. Well, and you said if you had the choice to do it again, you probably wouldn't have taken it. In many ways, you had that choice again, here in the last few years when they introduced the COVID vaccine.
I did. I was not in the military, although the military obviously put out a bunch of people who decided not to take it. I was a Department of the Army civilian at that point, and I refused to take the vaccine. And they were going to fire me. And it just that the Supreme Court stepped in and said, no, you can't. Otherwise, they probably would have fired me. And I was willing to live with that.
Yeah. And that's, and let's explore that a little bit, because that's a hard choice. There were people who were 18 years, 19 years into their career,
Yeah.
Almost at retirement. And either they
I know
had to,
several of them like that.
yeah, what happened to them?
They decided to take the shot. The ones that I know, because they just said they just couldn't throw away 19 years. They had to get to the 20-year retirement mark. So that was a decision they made, and again, individual decision. They have to figure out what their situations are. I was lucky. I was in a position where I didn't have, I was 6 months from my 10-year retirement from government service. But I wasn't willing to take that shot for that 10-year retirement. So I made that decision, and one of the reasons I was adamant is that I could make that decision. And I felt like it was my responsibility to make a stand, to stand up and say, what you're doing is wrong. And so that's what I did.
And it gets a little bit harder, when you're a commander, so.
It does. And they were removing people from command immediately if they didn't get the vaccine.
What would you recommend? I mean, this is just tough, and we're this is a tough question where there's probably no, I don't know. It's just a really tough question.
Yeah.
If you were still in command in the Army, leading soldiers, and command came down and said, you need to get all of your troops vaccinated, how would you handle that?
I would tell whoever told me that that is an individual decision. If they want to get vaccinated, then they will. If they don't, then you have to deal with that. But I'm not going to force somebody to get vaccinated.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there would have been repercussions for me on that answer, but that's the answer I would have given.
Well, that comes back to what you said earlier, that when you wake up in the morning, and you look in the mirror, you have to be happy with who you see.
You do. I mean, that's really what it comes down to, in my opinion, that you have to be comfortable for the rest of your life with the decisions that you make. And again, we all make bad decisions. We all make mistakes. I got that. But for the most part, that's how I make decisions is, am I going to regret this decision for the rest of my life? And if the answer is yes, then I'm willing to make a stand. And if that means that something happens to me, then I guess I'm happy to do that. And I've been that way for all my career. So some would say that's why I retired as lieutenant colonel.
No, well, and that's a factor, right?
I think it was, yeah.
You know, you look at who they pin stars on, and I'm not asking you to share your opinion here, but I look at people they pin stars on, and I don't want them fighting my wars. I want the people they're kicking out. You know, Chesty, you of course, for those who don't know, Chesty Puller, phenomenal Marine, a legend.
Yeah.
Fought in the in Korean War, World War II, but in the Korean War scored the highest kill ratio of any battle in U.S. history up until the first Gulf War, which I called War by Nintendo. And but yeah, Chesty Puller said, "Take me to the brig. I want to meet the real Marines."
Yeah.
And he was a warrior. He was a warrior that understood, some of the best warriors you're going to find out there are not the ones that are on the career path, that are going to get the stars pinned on their shoulders.
Yeah. I would say Patton was in the same mold as Chesty Puller. Yeah.
Yeah. And Patton, phenomenal leader. I have a book, War as I Know It, where his wife compiled.
Fantastic book.
Yeah. And, there's so many leadership lessons in that book. I mean, some of my favorite quotes, people that struggle understanding the difference between strategy and tactics. Patton explained it better than anybody I know. And he just said that strategy is like a steamroller. You go in a direction and you don't change. He said, for tactics, don't use steamroller strategy. Attack weaknesses.
Right.
Grab them by the nose and kick them in the pants.
Yeah.
I imagine in the 1940s, that was quite a vulgar statement, but
yeah. He wasn't afraid to say vulgar things, that's for sure.
But he was effective. He was very effective. And he was, I don't know if you probably know this, he was the only Allied commander that Field Marshal Rommel actually feared.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and another phenomenal leader, Field Marshal Rommel, but who stood up and paid the ultimate price for standing up for what he believed. If you believe the stories, and I do, that he was killed because he didn't plan the attempted assassination of Hitler, but he knew it was going on and he didn't try to stop it. So he made that decision. And I think, if you could ask him today, he'd say, I made the right decision. So I don't know. I mean, decisions are one of those things. We just have to understand that as leaders, we are responsible for those decisions. You can't pick and choose what you want to be responsible for. Leadership doesn't work that way. Although there's a lot of leaders in our country and world today who believe that's what it is. It isn't. You have to own the decisions you make. And if you make a mistake, which we all are going to, then you have to own that mistake. And as long as you do that, people are willing to forgive you for mistakes. If you say, hey, I messed up, this is how we're going to fix that. And in the future, let's reflect on it so we don't make that same mistake in the future. Maybe we can prevent some future leader from making the same type of mistake by reflecting on it and putting in some procedures, some policies, some general rules that would help future leaders not make the same mistakes.
Yeah. Yeah, and you said something really key there, and I know it's absolutely true. It's been true for me in life and business and everything is in general, people are forgiving. If you step forward and admit your mistake,
Yeah.
people are willing to forgive that. I mean, years ago, I worked for a company, I worked for a boss that would promise anything to Siemens. Siemens was our customer. And he would promise things that at the time he was making the promise, he knew we couldn't do. And and it was my job when we failed to deliver on the things that he promised, it was my job to go tell the Germans. And I got extremely good at delivering bad news.
Right. They probably didn't like seeing you because they knew what was coming.
Well, it's funny. Actually, this is really key. I felt horrible again and again and again. I just felt like we were treating them horribly. It really depressed me. There were the first meeting where we were going to agree to a bunch of things that we knew we couldn't do. I found a real quiet way to get out of that meeting. And I just say, hey guys, sounds like you have it covered. I'll be four doors down. If you need me, come get me. But I think you guys have this all figured out.
Yeah.
Yeah. And quietly, I'm like, you have it figured out wrong, but I can't change your mind on that. But the very first thing I would do when I had to deliver bad news to Siemens, I would just come out and say, guys, I've got some bad news. We're not going to meet the commitment that we made to you. And I had a formula that I would go through that in breaking it down that resonated well with the Germans. I think it resonates well with most people. But when you say that they didn't look forward to seeing me, I remember one day I'm sitting at my desk and phone rings and I look at the caller ID and it's a phone number from Germany. And it's one of the engineers from Siemens. And I pick it up and I answer. I'm like, hi, Reiner, what's going on? I mean, because he never called me. We would
Right.
usually email and we'd set up and this is back when international calling was expensive. And he said, Craig, my wife left me. He was going through a divorce. And in the tough time of all the people he could have reached out and called, he called me.
Yeah. I think probably, I don't know him. I don't know the situation completely, but just that part of the story tells me that he trusted you, that you were somebody who was honest, was going to give him some honest advice, some honest feedback. That's the other thing that leaders do is they're honest with their people. When you got bad news, it doesn't get any better by lying about it or hiding it. You got to come out and say it. And as long as you do that, then people still trust you. And that's what leadership is about. It's about trust, plain and simple. It's about trust. And if people don't trust you, then they're not going to follow you. They may still do what you tell them to do because they have to. You're the boss, or they have to quit their job or get fired. But they're not going to truly follow you, which there is a difference between following somebody, wanting to follow somebody, and doing what they're telling you to do because you have to.
Yeah. Well, and circling back to your discussion about, you have to make the tough choices. You have to look yourself in the mirror. Same job. We had a product that was being produced in the Philippines and there was some issue with production. My boss came to me and said, Craig, I need you to give me a name of one of your guys to send to the Philippines to go work on this production issue. And I said, okay, let me think about it. And I walked away and I was really uncomfortable about it. And this was right after 9/11. And the State Department had a travel advisory saying, don't go to the Philippines because the Abu Sayyaf,
Right.
And thought about it for about a day, and I went back to my boss and I said, you know, I've lived in the Philippines. It's the most dangerous place I've ever lived. It You have to be really have your wits about you to stay safe there. And so our company policy says that we will not travel to places where the State Department has a travel advisory, and the State Department has a travel advisory to the Philippines. I said, so I'm not going to give you one of my guys' names. If you need a name, it's going to be me, and there are going to be conditions.
Yeah.
And that was scary in the moment, because, maybe, I'd be labeled a misfit. Well, I always am, but I'm labeled a misfit. But back to your point, I couldn't get up the next morning.
Yeah.
I couldn't send what, I mean, as long as one of my guys was in the Philippines. I mean, when I went there, when the Marine Corps sent me there, they taught us how to stay out of trouble.
Right.
And we had some natural equipping that your average tech worker doesn't have.
That's right.
But they taught us how to stay out of trouble. I would be in stitches every day that one of my guys was in the Philippines, wondering, is he making smart choices? Is he being aware of his surroundings? Is he staying safe?
Yeah. Well, part of being a leader should be having concern for the people that you have the privilege to lead, and it is a privilege to lead people. And so, you want leaders who are taking care of their people, who care about the people, and understand that decisions they make absolutely have an impact on that person's life, even if it's not life and death, which most time it isn't life and death, but it's still their career, their families, how it affects their family life, how it affects them as a person. Those are things that leaders have to take into account, or should. And again, that should be part of the decision-making process whenever you got to make a decision, as it was in your case. And I think you made the right choice there. That's the choice I would have made, without a doubt. If you're going to send somebody, you're sending me, not one of my people.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that worked to my benefit was the company had a policy that we didn't send people to countries where the State Department had a travel advisory. I'd imagine you've run into that, where somebody gives you an order that you have to carry out, and sometimes your way around that order is it violates some policy that you have to go find. Have you had that happen?
I haven't, but I've known of people who have had that happen to them. Although, I and I use this. I always tell people this. When I was running my Army ROTC program, I had a lady that worked for me as my HRA, my Human Resource Administrator, and she was kind of she knew all the rules, she knew all the regulations about what we could or couldn't do, and how it all had to be done. And there were several times when I needed to help a cadet that was in my program. And when I went to her and I said, this cadet has this issue and this is what I want to do, and she'd say, you can't do that, it's against the regulations. And I said, well, I don't care. I mean, regulations are there, and they're there for a reason. I got that. But I refuse to let a rule or a regulation prevent me from taking care of somebody that I'm responsible for. Yeah. I said, and I'll put it in writing for you that I told you told me that it was against regulations, and I told you to do it anyway. I don't have a problem with that one bit, so that if anything happens, it comes back to me, not you. I'm the leader, I'm responsible, but I'm making that decision, and that's what we're going to do.
Yeah. Well, and let me ask this, in the context of, you said the reason you retired to lieutenant colonel is, you're a little bit of a, troublemaker. You weren't doing the behavior that would result in pinning stars on your shoulders.
Yeah.
And the how would you advise people to process that trade-off? Because I don't care what job you're in, even if you have your own company, at some point you're going to have to make a decision that, if you go one way, it's going to benefit you financially, or positionally. If you go another way, it won't. Yeah. How do people process that?
Yeah. Well, I was lucky as a kid. I mean, I kind of grew up with this concept because as a kid, my father used to tell me that life is about decisions and consequences. And every decision you make has a consequence, good or bad, but every decision you make has a consequence. And he said, and you got to get to the point in your life where you're making decisions that give you good consequences. Now, I guess you got to define what a good consequence is in this situation. I wake up, I get promoted, I get pay, the benefits of better pay, better position, whatever, and I don't necessarily like the decision I made, or I don't get that position or that promotion, but yet I every morning I can get up and look at myself in the mirror. And the rule that my father gave me as a kid was really simple. He said, every time you're going to make a decision, think about this. Would you want your mother to know that you're about to do what you're about to do? And if the answer is yes, then it's probably a pretty good decision. Go ahead and do it. If the answer is no, then you probably need to rethink that decision. And so, obviously I don't think about my mother anymore when I'm making decisions, but I think about, am I going to regret this? Am I going to think about this and wish I had done something else in the future? And it doesn't always work. I mean, sometimes you make a decision with the best intentions. Maybe you didn't have all the information, whatever, you make a decision and you do regret it later in life. But for the most part, that has worked pretty well for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Jack Welch, the former CEO of GE, his executives would come to him and they'd say, hey, I'm thinking about doing such and such. And I think part of what made Jack Welch a good leader was he didn't answer their question. They were wanting permission. And instead of giving him permission, he'd come back and he'd say, well, if you did that and it was printed on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, would you be okay with that?
Yeah. That's it. It's kind of the same rule that my father had. Yeah.
Yeah. And I ran into something recently. I was in this kind of an organization. I'll leave it a little bit vague. I was in an organization, been in it for a number of years, and finally decided it's time for me to leave. And I find out that they have a minimum 90-day exit. You have to give 90 days notice, and so they're going to still bill me for another 3 months. And my personality is, okay, I know that's the rule, but I'm still going to go back and ask. And I go back and ask, I say, hey, considering my longevity, I mean, I just didn't pop in here yesterday. Considering my longevity in this organization, would it be impossible to, let me go ahead and, stop immediately? And the guy came back with like the craziest answer of why they don't do it. And I looked at it and I was like, that's just completely BS. And I was like, that's a perfect sign that you have a bad policy. When you have to give me that answer, the right, what the honest answer is? No, we just want your money.
That's it.
And if you can't give the honest answer in that situation, you need to step back and question, are we doing the right thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so you've made the point a few times, sometimes we do the wrong thing. Sometimes we do the wrong thing out of right motives. Sometimes we do the wrong thing out of wrong motives. And as a leader, there's few things more gut-wrenching than realizing you made the wrong decision for your troops, for your employees, for those that you're leading.
Family.
Your family. What do you do at that moment?
Yeah, you just got to be honest. I mean, it really comes down to that. You got to say, okay, it's embarrassing. It's not fun. It's not whatever, but it doesn't get any better by not coming up and being honest and saying, I made a mistake. It only gets worse because again, the trust just starts to erode. And that's what all relationships are based on trust. And if that trust is gone, which it is in this country right now, I mean, in just about every profession, American people just don't have trust in them anymore, in our government, a lot of our businesses. Without that, things start to break down.
Yeah. Well, and one of my worries for our country is there are a few areas that when people When people start losing trust in the system of elections, when people start losing trust in the judicial system, that's when you start seeing anarchy. That's when you start seeing really, really bad things.
Yeah, ugly things.
And nothing to laugh at. Regardless of what side you are on
Yeah,
these things, it should grieve you that the trust is lost in these areas. And we need to come together and do what it takes to rebuild trust in all areas of government, because when it's lost and people feel hopeless, bad things happen.
yeah. And it always kills me when I hear people just throwing out the word Civil War and, those type of things. I said, obviously, you've never seen what happens during a civil war. I have. I mean, I've been in Bosnia, I've been in Kosovo. I mean, it is ugly, and that is not a road we want to go down.
Well, our own civil war is still our bloodiest war by far.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Nothing good comes from that.
Yeah. Well, and let me wrap up with this. So you had to make a tough choice in regards to you taking the vaccine. One of the areas where trust has been lost is in, the medical system and what have you. And, my hope is that we learn from that. What do you recommend people do moving forward to rebuild trust in that area?
Wow, that's a tough question. I think the biggest problem with our medical system right now is it is based on them making money, and I think that part of the problem is because the government is anytime the government subsidizes anything, it quickly becomes corrupt and money oriented, and people do things just for the money. You look at education is one of those that I think government money has corrupted our education system as well. But I think we got to get back to, first of all, I think people have to do their own research, because it's obvious that companies are making decisions that are not in the best interest of people. They're making it in the best interest of them making money. So people got to do their own research and figure out what to believe. But I think we got to get back to leaders making good decisions based on the betterment of everybody, not just themselves. And I think that we are far from that in this system right now in America. We have way too many leaders who are making decisions for their benefit, not for the benefit of the people that work for them or the benefit of the people they're serving, whether, it's a pharmaceutical company making drugs, or it's Congress, or it's whoever. We got to get back to leaders understanding that it's not about them, it's about the people that they have the privilege to serve. And that's what a leadership position is. It's service. And we've forgotten that too, I think.
I can't think of a better point to end on. Leadership is service. And we need to get back to that. Oakland, thank you for sharing that on Leaders and Legacies.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Craig. I've enjoyed it.